Warning. What you are about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Department announced it has identified the man who killed 9-year-old Candy Rogers in 1959.
It was possibly the most well-known cold...
By that point, I had already looked up, someone that a little girl murdered in 1959, so I knew who it was. It's just really sad to find out that someone that, not even that just your dad, but just someone in your family could do something like that. And he committed suicide. I had lived most of my life thinking he did it because he was very depressed or something, and now I think, no, he was evil. He was evil, and it was an escape in a way from it, but he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man, and he wasn't.
Washington, 1959. The oldest cold case in the state, cracked after 62 years. And it all came down to one thing, a sealed glass jar. Here's what that means. A little girl went out to sell mints. 9 years old, door to door, her own neighborhood. She never came home. Strangled, left in the woods. And her killer? He walked free for 6 decades. He lived 1 mile away. He was never a suspect. Not once, not ever. His name never showed up in a single tip. Okay, take a look at this for a moment. 3 generations of detectives worked this case. 3. They retired. They handed it down. They passed the file forward. Like a torch, from one career to the next. And every single one of them got it wrong. For 40 years, they were chasing the wrong man. A serial killer. A real one. Seemed perfect for it. But he didn't do it. The actual killer? He was hiding in plain sight. Same city, same streets, same cemetery. Now watch how this falls apart. Her name was Candace Elaine Rogers. Everybody called her Candy. She was 4'4", 60 pounds. A blonde, blue-eyed 4th grader, Holmes Elementary. She had a dog named Shep, a grandmother who made her oatmeal cookies. She was shy, small for her age, but she was a bluebird, campfire girls, and that meant something to her. March 6, 1959, first day of the mint-selling season. She picked up 7 boxes from her troop leader, came home, sat with her grandmother, talked through her route, which doors to try first. She wasn't nervous. She was excited. She had a plan. Sell enough boxes, earn her badge, win a free week at summer camp. At 4 p.m., she stepped out into the cold. And that timeline? It matters more than you know. 6:30 p.m., she's last seen alive, West Maxwell Avenue. People who knew her. They confirmed it. By nightfall, Spokane understood. 6 of her 7 mint boxes turn up, scattered along a hill. Not dropped, scattered, like they were thrown from a moving car. This wasn't a kid who got lost. Something happened to her. So the city moved. By morning, 1,200 people showed up to search. Marines, Boy Scouts, mail carriers, people on horseback. 2 bishops went on the radio, begging anyone with information to come forward. Every officer in the city was assigned. And then, it got worse. One day into the search, an Air Force helicopter is flying low, scanning the ground for any sign of her. It clips a high-tension power line, and it crashes, straight into the Spokane River. 3 men died. 3 men died, looking for one little girl. Spokane was now grieving in 2 directions at once. 16 days passed, nothing. Tips poured in, hundreds, then thousands. Detectives chased every one. No arrest, no trace. Then, March 21st, 2 airmen are out hunting, 7 miles from Candy's home, and they spot something near a tree. A pair of small blue suede shoes. Not dropped, placed. The next morning, a search party arrives. And within minutes, they find her. Buried under pine branches, off an old road, near an abandoned rock quarry. One of the officers who pushed that brush aside, a young man named Richard Olberding. He would carry that image for the rest of his life. Remember his name. We'll come back to him. The cause of death? Strangulation. The ligature torn from her own clothing. Her ankles bound with another strip of the same. She had suffered, badly. And the men who worked that scene knew it. Quick thing before we go deeper. If this is pulling you in, do me a favor. Hit subscribe. Tap that like. This is Crimewatch Hub, where no case stays buried forever. Now, back to it. The year 2001. A detective named Mindy Connolly makes a move. She sends Candy's preserved clothing to a lab, and for the first time, scientists pull a full DNA profile, 42 years after the murder, in an instant. They run the profile through the national database. Every known offender in the country. 0 hits. Nothing. Because the real killer had never been arrested for anything serious. He was never in the system. He was never in a single tip. He was a ghost. Washington, 1959. The oldest cold case in the state. Cracked after 62 years. And it came down to one thing. A sealed glass jar. Here's what that actually means. A 9-year-old girl went door to door, selling mints in her own neighborhood. She never came home. And the man who took her? He walked free for the next 62 years. He lived 1 mile away. He was never questioned, never named, never a suspect, until a jar, sealed shut in 1959, finally gave him up. So let's start where it started. March 6, 1959. A Friday afternoon in Spokane. It was the first day of mint selling season. The girl picked up 7 boxes. Campfire mints, a few cents each. She had a route in her head. Which neighbors to try, which doors first. And at 4 o'clock, she stepped outside. Cold air, gray sky, 7 boxes in her arms. That was the plan. Simple. Knock. Sell. Be home before dark. Nobody thought twice about it. Back then, kids did this alone. It was 1959. That's just how it worked. Now, here's what we know for certain. Not rumor, not theory. Fact. Pulled straight from the case file. 6:30 p.m. She was last seen alive. On the 2100 block of West Maxwell. People who knew her confirmed it. She was there, walking, doing her route. And then she was gone. But something else happened on that street. Right around the same moment. A car. A 1953 Ford. It came down the block fast. Too fast for a quiet neighborhood. It swung hard around the corner. And a man walking there had to throw himself out of its path. That man was searching for her. He'd been out for nearly an hour, calling her name into the cold. Checking yards, checking porches. He had no idea who was behind that wheel. He had no idea what that car was carrying. He just stepped aside and let it pass. And he would not understand what he saw. For the next 62 years. That's the timeline. That's the window. 6:30 p.m. on West Maxwell. A speeding Ford. A man forced off the road. Hold on to that car. Because it matters more than anyone knew. Now, to the first piece of physical evidence. Later that night, the boxes turned up. 6 of her 7 mint boxes. Found scattered along a roadway. And here's the detail investigators caught right away. They weren't dropped. They were scattered. Spread out. Like they'd been thrown. Tossed from a moving vehicle. A child who got lost doesn't do that. A child selling door to door doesn't do that. Those boxes told the police something cold. This was not a girl who wandered off. Something had happened to her. And then came the next clue. A single fingerprint. A partial print. Lifted off one of those boxes. The police preserved it, carefully. And they sent it straight to the FBI, the most advanced lab in the country. In 1959, everyone waited. Surely, this was the break, a print on the victim's own boxes. But the FBI ran it, and got nothing. The print was never identified. Not that year, not the next, not for decades. A piece of the killer, right there in their hands. And it led absolutely nowhere. That was the state of this case on night 1. A missing girl, a speeding car, scattered boxes, and a fingerprint with no name. That's all they had. But the city was not about to sit still. By morning, 1,200 people were searching for her. And one of the things they were about to find would sit untouched for the next 62 years. Before we go further, this case took 3 generations of detectives to crack, and we're walking every single step of it. That's what we do here at Crimewatch Hub. The cases the system almost forgot. Subscribe now, so you don't lose the thread. Because the next 30 minutes only get stranger. A whole city stopped what it was doing. That's how big this got. By the next morning, the search was everywhere. And it wasn't just police. It was Marines. It was Boy Scouts. Mail carriers who knew every street by heart. Utility workers. People on horseback. Ordinary folks who shut their doors and walked out to help. Then 2 bishops did something unusual. One Catholic, one Episcopal. They went on the radio. They went to print. And they made a direct plea. If you know something, come forward. Tell a minister, in confidence, no names. They were trying to reach one specific person, the kind who might confess to a priest, but never to a cop. That's how desperate Spokane already was. And then, the search itself turned tragic. The Air Force had joined in. They sent up a helicopter, a bird's-eye view, scanning ground the searchers couldn't cover on foot. It was flying low over the river, and it clipped a high-tension power line. The aircraft went down into the Spokane River. 5 men were on board. 3 of them did not survive. 3 men, gone. Not chasing a killer, just trying to find a missing child. The city was now carrying 2 tragedies at once, and still, there was no sign of her. Days passed, then more. The tips kept coming. The leads kept dying. For over 2 weeks, nothing. And then the break came from outside the search entirely. 2 men, out hunting, miles from the neighborhood, off Old Trails Road. They were walking through brush when one of them spotted something. A pair of small blue suede shoes. And here's the detail that stopped them. The shoes weren't dropped. They weren't tossed aside. They were placed. Set down. Deliberate. The hunters didn't touch them. They reported what they saw. And the next morning, a search party went in. It didn't take long. Not far from those shoes, they found her. Concealed. Covered over. Hidden on purpose. One of the officers who reached her that morning was a man named Richard Olberding. Remember that name. Because Richard Olberding is going to matter later. He was young then, early in his career, and what he saw on that ground, he would carry for the rest of his life. We're going to keep this part clean. The medical findings were straightforward. The cause of death was strangulation, and the restraints used on her were made from her own clothing. That's all you need to know. But that detail, the method, it's going to come back, because the same signature shows up again, years later. Hold on to it, now, Here's where 1959 gets interesting, because this is the part that solved the case. Think about what these detectives had. No DNA. The concept didn't exist yet. No database. No genetic testing. Nothing. In 1959, you had fingerprints and footwork. That was the whole toolkit. A killer who left no usable prints was, for all practical purposes, a ghost. So by every rule of their own era, this case should have died right there. But the detectives did something quietly brilliant. They didn't just investigate. They preserved. Every item from the scene, catalogued, logged, stored, kept, including a small biological sample. And one of them, we don't even know who, took that sample and sealed it inside a glass jar, closed the lid, logged it into evidence. And here's why that one choice changed everything. Glass is inert. It doesn't react. It doesn't break down. It doesn't leak moisture in or let it out. A sealed glass jar is about the most stable place you can put fragile biological material. It locks out air. It locks out contamination. It holds whatever's inside in a kind of suspension. Paper degrades. Cardboard rots. Most containers fail. Glass just waits. That detective had no scientific reason to do this. There was no test yet that could use it. He was preserving evidence for a science that wouldn't be invented for decades. He couldn't have known what he was protecting. He just knew not to throw it away. And so that jar went onto a shelf, in an evidence locker, in the dark, and it sat there, untouched, sealed, year after year after year. That detective never knew it. But he'd just solved the case. He just wouldn't be alive to see how. Here's the thing about this case. For 40 years, the problem wasn't a lack of suspects. The problem was the opposite. They were certain, and they were wrong. There was a name, a real one. A man named Hugh Beon Morse. And on paper, he fit perfectly. Morse wasn't a guess. He was a serial killer. A confirmed one. Multiple victims. He'd been in the Spokane area at the time, and he targeted exactly the kind of victims investigators feared they were dealing with. So far, so logical. But then came the detail that locked him in. During the original 1959 examination, a detective noted a stain on the clothing. It looked like gum, and it smelled like grape. Now here's why that mattered. Hugh Beon Morse had a known habit. He chewed grape gum, constantly. It had turned up around his other crimes. So a grape-smelling stain on this victim felt like a fingerprint with his name on it. And that's where the investigation went wrong. Because that stain was never confirmed. It was a smell, an impression, a note in a file. But the case was slow. The pressure was high. And when a case crawls for years, people start leaning on the one thing they have. A weak clue gets treated like a strong one. That's not a movie cliché. That's a real failure. It happens in actual investigations. A thin observation hardens into certainty. And for 4 decades, Morse was the answer. Everyone was sure. They were just sure of the wrong man. Then came the year 2001, and the science finally caught up to the jar. A detective named Mindy Connolly made the call. She took the preserved evidence and sent it out for DNA testing. And for the first time in 42 years, scientists pulled a full genetic profile from it, an actual DNA fingerprint of the killer. The first hard, objective lead in the entire case. So they did the obvious thing. They tested it against Morse. No match. Not close. Not partial. No match at all. The man they'd chased for 40 years was eliminated in a single test. The grape gum theory was dead. So they widened the net. They ran the profile through CODIS. That's the National DNA Database. Millions of profiles, offenders from across the country. If this killer was in the system anywhere, CODIS would find him. The result came back. 0. No hit, no partial, nothing. And that 0 tells you something important. CODIS only holds certain people. You land in it when you're arrested or convicted for the kind of crime that takes your DNA. So a blank result means one of two things. Either the killer was never caught for anything, or he was gone before the database existed. For this man, it was both. He was a true ghost. No record that mattered, no sample on file, nowhere in millions of profiles. The DNA was perfect, and it pointed nowhere. So the case stalled again. The profile sat, the sample sat, and what was left of it was almost nothing. Decades of testing had used it up. It was down to the last traces. Then, in 2018, everything changed. Not in Spokane, in California. That year, investigators caught the Golden State Killer, a man who'd evaded police for over 40 years. And they got him with a brand new method. It's called forensic genetic genealogy. And this is the part most channels skip. So let's actually walk through it. Here's how it works. You start with the killer's crime scene DNA, but you don't just check it against criminals. Instead, you build a richer genetic profile, and you upload it to consumer ancestry databases, the same kind regular people use to find cousins and build family trees. Now the search flips completely. You're no longer hunting for the killer directly. You're hunting for his relatives, distant ones, second cousins, third cousins, people who've never even heard his name. The database finds those genetic relatives. Then, genealogists go to work backward. They build family trees out from those cousins. Marriages, births, generations, branches. Slowly, the trees start to overlap, and the overlap narrows. Dozens of people become a handful. A handful becomes a single family line. The Golden State Killer proved it could be done. And the moment that arrest hit the news, cold case units across the country took notice, including Spokane. A forensic scientist named Brittany Wright refused to let this one die. But there was a catch. The sample from that jar was badly degraded. One lab looked at it and turned it down. Too far gone. Can't be done. So she found a lab in Texas, a place called Othram, built for exactly this, DNA everyone else gives up on. The fragile, the contaminated, the nearly destroyed. And she sent them the very last of it. This is the part most channels skip, the actual science that named him. We don't skip it. If you want the real forensic breakdown on every case, not the surface version, subscribe and hit the bell. Because what this method uncovered next put a name on the file for the first time in 62 years. Othram took the last traces from that jar, and they did what no one had managed before. They built a usable genealogical profile. They ran it through the ancestry databases. They followed the relatives. They built the trees. And the search kept narrowing. Down, and down, and down, until 62 years of nothing collapsed into one single family. The ghost finally had a shape. 3 brothers, all dead, all from Spokane. And only one of them had a daughter. For most of her life, she believed a simple story. Her father had died young, and the reason was a broken mind. Depression. That's what the family understood. A sad man who couldn't carry his own weight. That was the version she grew up with. His name was John Ray Hoff, and of the 3 brothers, he was the only father, the only one who left behind a child, which made his daughter the key to everything. So a detective picked up the phone. Sergeant Zach Stormont, Spokane Major Crimes. He called her, a woman named Kathy. He didn't lead with an accusation. He asked for help on a cold case. And what happened next tells you who she is. Within 45 minutes of that call, she was standing inside police headquarters. 45 minutes. But here's the part that matters. She didn't walk in confused. In those 45 minutes, she'd already searched online. And she found it. A 9-year-old girl, killed in 1959. A little girl selling mints. She put it together before she ever sat down. She walked through that door already knowing, already carrying what it might mean. And she didn't flinch. She volunteered her own DNA. No hesitation. No lawyer. No conditions. No delay. A sample that could tie her own father to the worst crime in the city's history. She gave it anyway, because she wanted the truth too. So they tested it. And on September 8, 2021, the first number came back. Kathy's DNA was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to the killer's profile than the DNA of a random person. Now stop. Let's be precise about that number. Because it's powerful, but it has limits. 2.9 million to 1 is enormous. It says she is almost certainly related to whoever left that DNA behind. It points straight at her family. And since she was the only child in that family line, it points straight at her father. But, and this matters, it was still indirect. They weren't comparing the killer's DNA to the killer. They were comparing it to his daughter. It was a powerful arrow. It was not the bullseye. And for this case, an arrow wasn't enough. Here's why. John Ray Hoff was dead. He'd been gone since 1970. That changes everything about how you prove this. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. No defense attorney to challenge the science. No courtroom where two sides fight it out. In a normal case, the system pressure tests the evidence. Here, there was no system to do that. Every conclusion would rest on one place: the detectives themselves. So they made a decision most people wouldn't. They could have stopped at 2.9 million. They could have called it solved. Instead, they said no. If they were going to name a man who could never defend himself, they had to be as certain as science allows. Not probably, not almost. As close to absolute as it gets. And there was only one way to get there. They needed his DNA. His actual DNA. Not his daughter's. Not a relative's. His. Which meant doing something drastic. They went to a judge. They requested a warrant. And the warrant was granted. On September 23, 2021, investigators carried it out. They exhumed John Ray Hoff. They recovered his remains. And they took a DNA sample directly from him. No more middlemen. No more relatives. Now it was the killer's profile against the man himself. And on October 1st, 2021, the final number came back. This is the one that ended it. The DNA from the crime scene was 25 quintillion times more likely to belong to John Ray Hoff than to any unrelated person on Earth. Let that land for a second. 25 quintillion. That's the number 25, followed by 18 zeros. There are not 25 quintillion people on this planet. There never have been. So a number that large isn't a probability anymore. It's not likely. It's not almost. It is past the point of coincidence. Past the point of doubt. There is no second candidate. No mix-up. No maybe. The first number, 2.9 million, pointed at the family. This number pointed at one man. And only him. After 62 years, the science had done everything science could do. They finally had his name. Now they had to understand how a man like this stayed invisible for 62 years. The answer was uglier than the silence. So now we can finally say who he was. And that's the part that's hard to sit with. Because it isn't what anyone pictured. For 62 years, people imagined a monster, a drifter, an outsider, a stranger who passed through. He was none of that. John Ray Hoff was born in Spokane, 1938. He grew up in the city, on its streets. He joined the Army at 17, and he was stationed right outside town. In 1959, he was 20 years old, and he lived 1 mile from Candy. 1 mile. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was a neighbor, a local face, and he was never once in the file. Not a tip, not a name, not a footnote. Now go back to that first night. A car speeding through a quiet neighborhood, swinging the corners like the driver knew them. Because the driver did know them. This was his city. These were his blocks. The thing that made him invisible was the same thing that made him dangerous. He belonged there. Then comes 1961, 2 years after Candy. And this is where the pattern shows itself. Hoff attacked a woman in Spokane. And the method should sound familiar. He used her own clothing to restrain her. The same signature, the exact same approach. But this time, it didn't end the same way. He was interrupted, and because of that, she survived. She lived to report it. He was arrested. He was convicted. And here's the number that stays with you. He served 6 months. 6 months. The Army discharged him as a deserter, and then he simply went back to ordinary life. Now think about what that means. 2 years after a child was killed, a man did almost the identical thing, in the same city. The same signature was sitting right there, and no one connected the two. The link was in plain sight, and it was missed. But there's one detail that cuts deeper than all of it. Hoff had a younger stepsister. In 1959, she was just 10 years old, and she wasn't a stranger to this story. She was a campfire girl, too. In fact, she had been given a specific role. She was Candy's assigned big sister, the older girl who looks out for the younger one. So when Candy disappeared, this child grieved her, and she did something heartbreaking without knowing it. She cried about it, to her brother, to Hoff. She told him how much she missed her friend, how frightened everyone was. And he sat there, and he listened, and he said nothing. Decades later, when detectives finally told her the truth, she was devastated. She had carried that grief her whole life, never knowing the answer was sitting beside her. And then there's the cemetery. When investigators went looking for his grave, they found something they did not expect. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff had been buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers, just yards away from her. While her family came to visit, while they stood at her headstone and wondered. He was lying in the same ground. Nobody knew. And when the Hoff family learned this, they did something no one asked them to do. They had his remains moved to a different cemetery, away from her, so that Candy could rest in peace. It wasn't justice. It couldn't be. But it was the one thing they had to give. Now, to the people who never gave up. At the 2021 press conference, sat a retired captain named Richard Olberding, the same officer from decades earlier, one of the men who found her in 1959. He had carried that day his entire life, and he lived just long enough. "I thank God," he said, "that I lived long enough to see the end of this case." And when a reporter asked the lead sergeant how many hours this case had taken, he didn't count in hours. He said, "This isn't measured in hours. This is measured in careers." 3 generations of detectives worked this file, Each one handed it forward. None of them closed it. And the last generation finally did. But one question still has no clean answer. In 1961, this man showed exactly what he was, and the system gave him 6 months. The danger was on the record. The signature was on the record. And still, it took 62 years to connect it. That's not a comfortable thought. It's just the true one. Candy waited 62 years for her name to mean justice. There are cold cases out there still waiting, and the only reason this one closed is that nobody let it go. So don't let go either. Subscribe to Crimewatch Hub, and tell me in the comments which forgotten case we dig into next. The jar sat for 62 years. Somewhere, another one is still waiting.